Welcome back to part 3. First off, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been following along. The response to the first 2 parts has been incredible, and seeing how much these stories mean to you all really keeps me going. Now, up until now, we've been following my career pretty much in order. But before we push any further down the timeline, I feel it's time to pause the clock for a bit. A life in commercial diving doesn't just happen in neat chronological order. When you spend decades working under oil rigs and living in chambers, it isn't the dates you remember, it's the moments. Some of those moments are dead funny. Some of them, well, not so funny. And then there are the ones where your heart hits your throat and you realize just how fast things can turn dangerous down there. So for this next stretch, we're setting the calendar aside. No dates, no years. Just pure, unvarnished, true stories that I need to get off my chest. Let's dive in. Trial by fire, my time at Fort Bavizand. It all started with a letter. Months after I'd written off to Cumex, the French commercial diving outfit, a letter finally landed on my doormat. The instructions were short and sharp: get myself down to Plymouth by the following Monday. I remember leaving home on that cold, wet morning to catch the train down south. Sitting on that carriage, my head was spinning with mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt bloody lucky. Out of probably hundreds of applicants, they'd picked me. On the other hand, a cold knot of anxiety was twisting in my stomach. It's not as easy as people think to just pack up your life and head off into the complete unknown. As the train rattled along, your mind starts ticking over, asking the same question over and over: what on earth am I letting myself in for? When I arrived in Plymouth, I flagged down a taxi from the station and headed straight for the fort. They marched us into our accommodation, old, damp World War II bunkers tucked away under the barracks of the old fort structure. There were about 8 of us crammed into each bunker. And just like that, day 1 was over, wrapped up with a stern warning: be up early tomorrow. Day 1, the weeding out begins. They made damn sure we were up early. At 4:30 a.m., while it was still pitch black, freezing, and howling with rain and wind, they dragged us out of our bunks. Before we even had a chance to wake up, they ordered us to start running. Up and down the steep hills surrounding the camp we went, leapfrogging over each other in the mud and wet grass. We were pushed continuously for an hour until my legs were trembling and I was completely knock-kneed. When they finally let us stop, we headed in for breakfast: eggs, bacon, and toast. But the reality of where we were hit immediately: 3 lads were booted off the course before breakfast was even over. They were simply told they were unfit and sent packing. A couple of them were top-quality lads. Watching them get chopped on the very first morning was a proper trauma for them, and bloody disheartening for the rest of us. That was the moment I realized the truth: this wasn't a training course. It was an expensive, cutthroat interview. Cumex was footing the bill, and Bavizand's only job was to ruthlessly separate the men from the boys. Commando drills and zero room for error. The pressure never let up for a single second. Next, they had us running up and down the harbour carrying heavy British oxygen steel cylinders on our shoulders, looking like a beach raiding party in the front line. Then came the jump. Fully kitted up in diving gear with heavy twin cylinders strapped to our backs, we had to leap 20 feet off the harbour wall into the ocean like commandos. To be honest, after hitting the water from that height with all that heavy kit, I was surprised nobody passed out. And the rules were savage: if you lost a fin when you hit the water, you were chucked off the course on the spot. Once you hit the water, there was no resting. We had to swim half a mile out around a buoy and back, organized into groups of 3. You had to look after your mates. If one guy in your trio couldn't make it, you had to haul him back with you. If you showed up at the slipway without your third man, you were booted out, too. Even the evenings offered no relief. Back inside the fort, we were put through night classes in total darkness. We had to tie complex knots behind our backs in the dark and send blind rope signals to each other, moving left, right, down, up, and right. Sitting on our bunks late at night, we'd practice rope signals on each other in the dark. I remember thinking to myself, do saturation divers down in the North Sea at 300 feet really use rope signals? But you didn't ask questions, you just did it. Then came the kit issue. The woman handing out the diving gear had a voice like steel. She looked us dead in the eye and said forcefully, if you damage that suit, you're out. If you lose the suit, you're out. She handed each of us a plastic laundry basket containing a mask, fins, a heavy lead weight belt, and a diver's knife. Every single item was stamped with an assigned number. She repeated her warning just to make sure it sunk in. If you lose any of your equipment, you are out. One of our main tasks was erecting scaffolding frames underwater at the base of the breakwater wall. We were working off an old, battered 50-foot fishing boat, nothing special at all. It was that miserable time of year when the ocean water was bone-chillingly cold and pitch black with mud and silt. I was picked to be the diver wearing the dreaded band mask. Down at the seabed, the bottom was a dangerous clutter of bent scaffolding poles left over from previous runs. I was doing my best to block out how cold and murky it was, but to be completely honest, I hated every second of it. I was just waiting and praying for someone on the surface radio to call me up. I'd been down about 30 minutes when suddenly, my air supply cut off completely. Down there in the dark, with a rubber teat jammed in your mouth and a mask filling up with icy water, you can't exactly scream for help over the comms radio. Panic spikes fast. The only thing on my mind was survival, get to the surface now. I kicked for the top with everything I had, but as I neared the surface, my umbilical hose got snagged on the tangled scaffolding below me. I was trapped at the surface, my face bobbing barely an inch above the water 1 second and dragged under the next by the rolling swell. I was gasping for air, fighting for my life. And what did I get from topside? The instructor was standing on the deck above, screaming down at me. I'd had enough. I unbuckled my weight belt, dropped it, ripped off the mask, and ditched it into the sea below. Seeing me dump the kit, the instructor went absolutely frantic, dancing up and down on the deck of the boat like a madman. Furious, exhausted, and full of adrenaline, I felt like climbing up and clobbering him right there. The only thing stopping me was his size. I dragged myself over to the diving ladder, looked him dead in the eye, and spat back. I need to breathe, you know. Tell me what's going on, he shouted back. I tried to explain that my air had cut out while struggling to catch my breath and pull myself up the ladder, but he just kept going on and on, screaming at me. The truth topside. Reluctantly, he finally decided to check the surface equipment, something he should have done before I ever dipped a toe in the water. What he found was terrifying. Although the diesel compressor had been noisy and running on deck, my umbilical line had never actually been connected to it. Topside had put me in the water on a standby Luxfer 60-cylinder mounted on deck. That standby cylinder was meant to be an emergency backup in case the compressor failed or a hose got severed. Because I was working down at 60 feet on free flow, I had been breathing purely off that small standby cylinder the entire time. Eventually, the cylinder's pillar valve froze solid from the rapid airflow, shutting off my air supply completely and leaving me to drown at the bottom. The final threat. That night, after I'd cleaned the mud off myself and taken a shower, the instructor caught me alone in the corridor. He slammed me up against the wall, pinning me there. He leaned in close and growled, "If you ever speak to me like that again, you'll get a lot more than you bargained for." He told me that the only reason I wasn't being kicked off the course that night was because it was an equipment failure on their end. Then he looked at me and said he could still make a diver out of me, before leaving me with one last warning. That was Bavizand. You weren't just learning to dive, you were surviving an absolute trial by fire. In 1974, civilian commercial diving was in its absolute Wild West era. The North Sea oil boom was exploding, the money was massive, and the demand for divers was desperate. Because there was no blueprint for training deep-sea civilian divers, the early schools had to invent the rules as they went along. Looking at the rugged, isolated layout of Fort Bavizand, it's easy to see how it became a world unto itself. The early training ran right out of that small harbor and the stone casemates. Because the site was physically cut off from the rest of Plymouth, instructors had unchecked authority, creating an environment where extreme behavior could easily go unnoticed by the outside world. Almost all of the instructors at Bavizand and other early schools in the mid-70s were ex-military, typically former Royal Navy clearance divers, SBS, or clearance diving supervisors. They imported a militant, combative boot camp mentality to civilian training. While physical fitness and discipline are vital offshore, some of these instructors treated civilian trainees with a level of aggression and personal hazing that went far beyond professional instruction. Testing for panic, the cruel way. Instructors often justified their rough treatment under the guise of stress testing. The logic was that if a trainee panicked in the cold, dark waters of the fort's harbor, they would surely die at 300 feet on an oil rig in the North Sea. To test this, instructors would routinely scream at, belittle, and physically push trainees on the slipway. Intentionally rip off masks or turn off a trainee's air supply underwater without warning to force a panic reaction. Make trainees endure punishing, freezing cold tasks in the harbor for hours until they were borderline hypothermic. While the goal of weeding out those prone to panic made sense on paper, in practice, it frequently degenerated into personal power trips, intimidation, and systemic bullying. The pull of the deep was something none of us could resist. Ever since diving for the golf balls, I was making regular dives round Anglesey, Scapa Flow, the Lake District, flooded quarries, Stony Cove. When the British Sub-Aqua Club finally expanded into Manchester, joining wasn't even a question, it was an absolute necessity. I still remember the pride of holding that original Manchester certificate, the official stamp declaring I was cleared to plunge down to 100 feet alongside any qualified diver. For me, the most outstanding diving we ever did has to be Scapa Flow, on the wrecks on the German fleet, scuttled during the war. The Tedney monobuoy, operated by Conoco, now Phillips 66, in the Humber estuary, is infamous in the offshore world. They positioned that single-point mooring, SPM, right in the mouth of the estuary where the tides are notoriously brutal, running far too fast for a normal diving operation. Compounding the danger, the water is a thick, blinding brown sludge of stirred-up river silt and mud. When the original diving contractor ripped those massive subsea hoses off and realized the ripping current made it completely impossible to bolt them back onto the manifold, it triggered a full-scale corporate panic. With production totally halted, very large crude carriers, VLCCs, and tankers were stacking up on the horizon, burning money by the minute with millions of dollars of crude cargo hanging in the balance. That is exactly why they called in North Sea Diving Services. They needed specialized divers and me who could handle blind, high-current rigging under extreme pressure. Plunging into the ocean was like falling into an inkwell. The midday sun vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, pitch-black void. The water pressure squeezed my chest, and the only sound was the raspy, mechanical hiss of my own breathing. It was freezing, blind, and utterly terrifying. Every single movement had to be calculated. The massive underwater hose groaned under the current, shifting like a blind leviathan. One wrong calculation and the steel would crush me against the manifold like an insect. I crept downward into the abyss, one hand gripping the cold, slimy steel flanges of the hose. I used my other arm like a blind man's cane, waving it wildly through the black water to feel for killer chains swinging invisibly in the dark. The thought hit me hard, I might not come out of this dive in one piece. We were dancing on the razor's edge of safety. It was an underwater disaster zone waiting for a single human error. But I wasn't about to complain. I had a job to do. Fighting the blind surge, I finally managed to shackle the heavy hose end to the manifold. Victory! We were making progress, but the clock was ticking. The currents were too violent now. We were trapped topside for 6 hours until the next slack water. If my rigging held against the ocean's wrath, we could run the heavy 9 3 wires through the bottom flanges to rip the pieces together. I scrambled out of my gear, thawed my frozen bones in a hot shower, and inhaled breakfast with the ravenous hunger only a diver understands. That is when the real horror story emerged. While I was trapped in the dark underwater, chaos had erupted on deck. The massive crane had ripped completely free from its mounts, rocking wildly right above my head. If it had toppled, it would have crushed my dive line and buried me alive at the bottom of the sea. In the mess hall, the crane driver was sitting in the corner, staring blankly into space, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold his coffee. He was in a state of sheer psychological collapse. I walked over and slammed my mug on the table. "You almost killed me out there," I said, my voice tight. "What the hell happened?" He looked up, wild-eyed and pale as a ghost. The whole deck groaned, he stammered, his voice cracking. The weld snapped like toothpicks. The cab started tilting toward the water. I thought the entire rig was capsizing. I didn't think, I just jumped. It was the fastest the useless bastard had moved the entire trip. We were being pushed to the brink because management hired a basic operator instead of an offshore specialist. Bill, the supervisor, walked in and slammed his hands down on the table. "Nothing we can do now," he muttered, defeated. "The crane is compromised. We have to wait for a shore-based welding crew. It'll take days to find anyone crazy enough to come out here on short notice." I looked out the porthole at the mangled, torn steel where the crane had ripped out of the deck. "You don't need a shore crew," I said flatly. "Let's have a look at the ship's welding machine. I'll fix it." Bill stopped dead in his tracks and stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Can you weld that?" "I'm a welder by profession," I told him, standing up. And frankly, the idiot who welded it the first time had no clue about offshore structural strain. I'll make it bulletproof." He blinked, suddenly realizing he wasn't just dealing with a diver, but a lifeline. To bypass the corporate suits and insurance red tape, Bill needed to call head office immediately. But first, we raided the workshop. We needed heavy metal plating to fabricate massive, reinforced brackets to anchor the beast back to the deck. While I was assessing the steel, Bill ran to the radio room and called head office and got me a pay raise. I was now getting per day what I got for a week in the factory. A few days later, the corporate office called back with a wild proposition. They didn't just want me fixing cranes, they wanted me spearheading dangerous operations in Nigeria. Nigeria? I muttered. But the adrenaline was addictive. I undertook the job. The corporate office wasn't asking, they were ordering. "We need you on a plane to Nigeria immediately," the voice on the radio had said, and just like that, the clock started ticking. For a guy who had only flown once in his life, the sudden scramble for international paperwork was a whirlwind. First came the passport office, a chaotic rush of express fees and overnight forms to get my documents stamped and approved before the weekend. But the real gauntlet was the local health department. To set foot in West Africa in them days, you couldn't just show up, you had to be a walking shield against tropical diseases. They lined me up at the clinic and rolled up both of my sleeves. First came the mandatory yellow fever jab, followed immediately by the sting of the smallpox vaccine and the cholera shot. They even handed me a prescription for bitter antimalarial pills to start taking before my boots even touched the tarmac. By the time they stamped my official bright yellow international certificate of vaccination, both of my arms were throbbing and sore. The flight out of London was an absolute sensory overload. For a guy who had only been in the air once before, sitting in the belly of a massive, roaring commercial jet bound for West Africa felt completely surreal. As the engine screamed to life and the plane barreled down the runway, the sheer G-force slammed me back into my seat. I watched the grey English coastline shrink into tiny patches of green before disappearing beneath a thick blanket of clouds. The journey was a grueling, multi-hour haul. My arms were still throbbing and stiff from the cocktail of yellow fever, smallpox, and cholera jabs I'd received just days earlier. Every time I shifted in a narrow seat, a sharp ache reminded me of the frantic rush to get my paperwork sorted. To make matters worse, the cabin air was hot and dry, and I was already sweating through my shirt from the pre-travel nerves. Looking around the cabin, the reality of the situation began to set in. The plane was packed with a gritty mix of international oil workers, roughnecks, and engineers, all speaking in a dozen different accents. Cigarette smoke drifted through the cabin, completely legal back then. I actually smoked a pipe on that airplane, mixing with the smell of stale coffee and aviation fuel. Everyone on board seemed to have a hard-edged look about them, the look of men heading into tough, unpredictable territory. As night fell, the plane flew into a massive tropical thunderstorm over the African continent. The aircraft began to buck and plunge violently in the turbulent air. Lights flickered in the cabin, and the engines groaned against the shifting wind shears. Looking out the small window, the sky was a terrifying pitch black, torn apart by jagged flashes of lightning that illuminated the massive banks of storm clouds around us. Finally, the plane broke through the storm clouds, descending through the thick, heavy haze of Lagos. As the tires slammed onto the tarmac with a deafening screech, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the cabin. I grabbed my duffel bag, checked that my passport and yellow card were secure in my jacket pocket, and prepared to step out into the unknown. The cabin doors swung open, and the humid air of Lagos hit like a physical blow, thick with the smell of exhaust, burning wood, and tropical sweat. Walking onto the tarmac, the noise was deafening. Armed soldiers in olive-drab uniforms patrolled the perimeters, their faces expressionless, fingers resting near the triggers of their automatic rifles. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was a pressure cooker of pure chaos. Hundreds of travelers from all over the globe pushed and shoved through narrow corridors, the air completely stagnant under flickering fluorescent lights. Passport control and health security. Armed soldiers and glaring officers. The crucial check, the yellow card. The stamp falls. The baggage gauntlet. Chaos beyond the glass. The open streets. I joined the agonizingly slow line for customs, my heart hammering louder than it ever did underwater. When I reached the desk, a stone-faced border guard glared at me, his eyes shifting from my passport to my face. "Vaccination certificate," he barked, holding out a heavy hand. I pulled the bright yellow card from my pocket, the one proving I'd survived the grueling gauntlet of yellow fever, smallpox, and cholera jabs just days prior. He inspected the stamps with agonizing slowness, flipping the pages while a soldier stood just behind him, watching my every move. For a long, tense moment, nobody breathed. Then, the heavy ink stamp slammed down onto my paperwork. I was cleared. I grabbed my heavy duffel bag from a mountain of luggage and pushed through the final set of double doors. The transition to the outside world was an absolute explosion of the senses. The moment I stepped onto the open street, a wall of humanity descended upon me. Hundreds upon hundreds of people swarmed the terminal exit, creating a roaring sea of voices that drowned out the sound of the idling engines. "Taxi! Taxi, master! I take you to the docks! Hey, white man! Good price, best car!" Dozens of drivers and porters lunged forward, hands reaching out to grab the straps of my duffel bag, all competing aggressively for a fare. The air was a thick haze of red dust, blue exhaust smoke, and screaming horns as battered yellow cars jammed the roadways bumper to bumper. It was a chaotic, high-voltage gauntlet where one wrong move felt like you'd be swallowed whole by the crowd. I gripped my bag with a white-knuckle hold, locked my eyes forward, and began to force my way through the crushing sea of people to find my ride. Thank you so much to everyone for watching and following along. We have survived the brutal tides of the Humber estuary, raced against the clock to get the emergency medical clearance, endured a terrifying tropical storm in the air, and finally broken through the high-voltage chaos of Lagos Airport customs. Nigeria is a completely unknown world, and the dangers waiting out on that oil field are going to test every single bit of diving and engineering skill we've got.